I'm Jennifer Brown, and on behalf of the Center for Literary Arts at Frostburg State University, I'd like to welcome you to this 15th annual Western Maryland Independent Literature Festival online this year. But especially I'd like to welcome you to this event with Gerry LaFemina. I'd like to thank the sponsors who make our work possible. They are the Allegheny Arts Council, the City of Frostburg, Savage Mountain Punk Arts, and several offices at Frostburg State University, including the Office of the President, the Office of the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Department of English and Foreign Languages and Literature. As you read on the event description, Gerry LaFemina believes poetry is the highest art form, believes everyone should rock out with a guitar at least once, even if they can't play, believes teaching is a calling, believes the New York City subways are beautiful, even if they smell bad, believes in love, Bigfoot, and other mythic creatures, believes in the power of a good meal, a good night's sleep, good whiskey, and good friends, believes in top-down driving and fast music, believes laughter is a type of prayer. As one who has enjoyed the occasional good whiskey with him, I'm fortunate to call him my good friend and colleague. Please join me in welcoming Gerry LaFemina.
And Jen Brown, we've shared lots of good laughter prayers. Hi, everybody. I don't know how many of you are out there in TV land. I feel like, as always with these things, I will say this, we were really looking forward to doing this in person. We actually had scheduled a show for tonight, hoping people would stick around and listen to some music. Hopefully next year, we will all be in person. I want to thank Jen for having me do this. And thank you all for joining us. It's apropos that I'm doing this talk today on behalf of Savage Mountain Punk Arts on Richard Hell's 72nd birthday. Richard Hell is a poet, a fiction writer, has written an incredible memoir, and was the original bass player and principal songwriter of the punk bands Television, the Neon Boys, and the Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers before he settled on Richard Hell and the Voidoids. So as I discuss poetry and song lyrics, that's someone who did both and did both fairly well on his birthday today. It's pretty apropos. I want to start by reading a poem, actually. This is a poem by my friend Wynn Cooper. It is called Fun. All I want to do is have a little fun before I die, says the man next to me, out of nowhere, apropos of nothing. He says his name's William, but I'm sure he's Bill or Billy, Mac or Buddy. He's plain ugly to me, and I wonder if he's ever had fun in his life. We're drinking beer at noon on Tuesday in a bar that faces a giant car wash. The good people of the world are washing their cars on their lunch hours, hosing and scrubbing as best they can in skirts and suits. They drive their shiny Datsuns and Buicks back to the phone company, the record store, the genetic engineering lab, but not a single one appears to be having fun like Billy and me. I like a good beer buzz early in the day, and Billy likes to peel the labels from his bottles of Bud and shred them on the bar. Then he lights every match in an oversized pack, letting each one burn down to his thick fingers before blowing and cursing them out. A happy couple enters the bar, dangerously close to one another, like this is a motel, but they clean up their act when we give them a look. One quick beer and they're out, down the road and in the next state for all I care, smiling like idiots. We cover sports and politics, and once when Billy burns his thumb and lets out a yelp, the bartender looks up from his want ads. Otherwise, the bar is ours, and the day and the night, and the car wash too, the matches and buds, and the clean and dirty cars, the sun and the moon, and every motel on this highway. It's ours, you hear? And we've got plans, So relax and let us in. All we want is to have a little fun. That is probably one of the most famous poems written in the late 20th century. And you probably never heard it that way. It was just read the way it was intended to be read. Instead, you've probably heard it more like this. Hit it. This ain't no disco. It ain't no country club either. This is LA. All I want to do is have a little fun before I die, says the man next to me out of nowhere. It's apropos of nothing. He says his name is William, but I'm sure he's Bill or Billy or Mac or Buddy. And he's plain ugly to me, and I wonder if he's ever had a day of fun in his whole life. We're drinking beer at noon on Tuesday in a bar that faces a giant car wash. The good people of the world are washing their cars on their lunch breaks, hosing and scrubbing as best they can in skirts and suits. They drive their shiny Datsuns and Buicks back to the phone company, the record store too. Well, they're nothing like Billy and me. Because all I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun until the sun comes up over Santa Monica Boulevard. I like a good beer buzz early in the morning, and Billy likes to peel the labels from his bottles of Bud. He shreds them on the bar, and he lights every match in an oversized pack, letting each one burn down to his thick fingers before blowing and cursing them out. And he's watching the bottles of Bud as they spin on the floor, and a happy couple enters the bar, dangerously close to one another. The bartender looks up from his want ads. But all I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun, but I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun until the sun comes up over Santa Monica Boulevard. Otherwise, the bar is ours, the day and the night and the car wash too, the matches and the buds and the clean and dirty cars, the sun and the moon. All I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling the party has just begun. All I want to do is have some fun. I won't tell you that you're the only one. All I want to do is have some fun until the sun comes up over Santa Monica Boulevard. Until the sun comes up over Santa Monica Boulevard. Win Cooper is probably the most famous poet nobody's ever heard of. The most heard poet nobody's ever heard of in America. And the reason I started with that is because it demonstrates what I think is clearly the similarities of song lyrics and poetry and the differences. Obviously, song lyrics and lyric poems get their root from the same word. And obviously, for years, they were pretty much the same thing. The ballad, the most famous sort of poetry form in history, was sung. We have love ballads still today set to music. And for a long time, poetry and song lyrics were more often than not interchangeable. And then things start to happen, mostly with industrialization. And surely by the time recorded music is available and the industry starts, that becomes Tin Pan Alley and eventually becomes the Brill Building, which becomes the hit makers of the pop era. What you have is an industry creating phonograph records that are based in 4/4 time or 3/4 time, common meter, and doing all sorts of rhyming of love and above, to the point where at a certain point, if you wanted to actually write poems, you had to bust out. I don't think it is any surprise that modernism in poetry happens at the same time as this industry in music is happening. This idea of keep it new, the idea of imagism, and all the sort of responses. You see this in visual art to film and photography too, by the way. This kind of wanting to react to the commercialization of images, the commercialization of certain types of lyrics. So I don't think that split at modernism is accidental. I actually believe it is definitive. For poetry to not disappear in the wake of an industry working in fixed rhyme and meter has to distinguish itself, and the way to do that is free verse. That's not to say that they're not similar, and it's not to say that they don't do similar things. Poetry tells stories, songs tell stories. Poetry expresses emotion, songs express emotion. Poetry celebrates lives and ideas and experiences, and song does the same thing. But they're different art forms. And although in the quote by me that Jen Brown started that says poetry is the highest art form, this always gets me in trouble because it makes people think that I think of songwriting or fiction writing as lesser art forms. That's not to say I don't. I totally do. They're different art forms. They are different art forms, and one's not better than the other. I know so many poets who have written songs, and I know so many poets who have written novels, and they think if somebody publishes my novel, if somebody were to record my songs, people would actually hear me or read me, and I would be taken seriously as an artist. And I know any number of fiction writers who have an envelope full of poems in their desk drawer, and they think if people knew I wrote poetry, they would think of me as profound, and then they would take me seriously as writers. And musicians, they want to be called poets. He's a very poetic songwriter. The poetry of his songs, they're different. They're different. They're as different as films are from plays. Very similar. They're both written in scripts, but you can do certain things differently in one than the other. And I think of the great E.L. Doctorow essay from the early 90s called Standards, in which he says everything about standards, musical standards, the Great American Songbook, relies on the idea that songs want to be familiar, as opposed to that modernist doctrine of make it new. What do I mean by that? All I want to do is have some fun. I got a feeling I'm not the only one. All I want to do is have some fun. And I got to tell you, I'm not the only one. That refrain, it's the worst part of the song, as it turns out, no surprise. But the refrain is, I don't want to say it's trite, but it's familiar in a particular way that grounds that non-rhyming poetry in a tradition, and that makes it seem familiar. And that's not a bad thing. As someone who moves between writing poems and songs, the idea of a hook is really important in a song. I love the idea that people have left my shows singing a chorus they'd never heard before. That's the idea. But the unfortunate aspect of the hook is that the hook becomes the most memorable part, not the sadness of that guy burning his fingers in the matchbook. Those two guys, not the sadness of these two guys in a crappy bar on a workday afternoon with no job to go to. And so the very strength of a pop song, of the hook, is a weakening effect of the lyrics. And so I think now of a great quote I heard David Bowie say on NPR. The interviewer said, very taken with the fact that she was interviewing David Bowie, and who wouldn't be, and said something about the poetry of his lyrics. He basically said, stop right there. I'm not a poet. He said, poets have to rely solely on the words. I don't, because the mood of a song is as much conveyed by the chord structure, the instrumentation, the tempo, any sort of dynamic shift that comes with removing or adding instrumentation into any given mix. And that poets have to do all that strictly with language. On the other hand, the free verse revolution has led to a sensibility that poets can make up the rules as they go along. Whereas in composing a song, you do have a set structure of metrical verses, usually more often than not rhyme, and the confines of the length of a pop song and the confines of that book. And the give and take, right? Everything I love about writing poems, the freedom to sort of do what I want, to make my own rules, to sort of go, what if I change this ending and see where this other turn takes me? Oh my gosh, it takes me another page. If I tried to do that in a song, the restrictions of genre and the restrictions of other musicians, Gerry, shut up, come into play, as well as the strictures of form, right? Most pop songs have a, verse, chorus, middle eighth or bridge, verse, chorus structure. There are variations on that. You could have 3 verses, you could have pre-choruses, whatever, but ultimately you are confined to a 3.5-minute song. And that can be really entrapping, but it can also be really liberating. I mean, I think one of the things that people lose in writing free verse, if they're not tough on themselves, is that they think they can be lazy in their language. That old comment by Frost that writing free verse poetry is like playing tennis without a net is not the lampoon of free verse that formalist poets like to claim. What they're saying is anybody who's ever grown up and tried to play tennis without a net, or like I did, try to play baseball without a baseball diamond or gloves and right? We played stickball. But as soon as you say you're going to play baseball with a broomstick and a Spalding ball on an asphalt street, it means you have to create rules. Hit the ball 3 sewer caps, 3 manhole covers, that's a home run. Hit that anything, that hits the sidewalk, before that Buick on the right-hand side of the street is a foul ball. You have to create rules, and free verse poetry requires you to do that. Song lyrics sort of give it to you. On the other hand, what I love about songwriting that I never have with poetry is the songwriting is incredibly collaborative. And what you see in that opening is that Sheryl Crow, when she recorded Win Cooper's poem and converted it to song, she had to cut things. She had to make decisions. She had to add a couple of things and not just the hook in order to keep that song in that sort of pop song structure and sensibility. I'm going to ask if there are any questions, because I could talk about this stuff all day. I will say this, by the way, I don't know why songwriters want to be poets, because let me tell you, people can name 50 living American songwriters. Most people cannot name 50 living American poets. Just saying.
So we don't currently have questions in the chat.
Do you have a question, Jen Brown?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that I'm thinking about is just like my experience of listening to albums with you, right? We talked the other day about English Settlement, which is an album that I love, and I know that you love too.
Great.
And
that's XTC for those not going, what album are they talking about?
So, and I think that, in some ways, right, like that album is really interesting because it does what you're describing, right? There are absolutely these hooks. There's this kind of traditional structure, but there's also
startling images.
Yeah, right, and like more complexity maybe than what we might get from some other albums.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting when we think of these artists that we might say are poetic, whether it's Jim Morrison or Patti Smith, Elvis Costello, surely the XTC guys. Oh, what's his name? Andy Partridge, yes. Fits into this category. I also think somebody like Chuck D or Tupac Shakur falls into this category too. That they often come from a tradition that rubs against pop sensibilities. One of the great stories is that Exene Cervenka and John Doe, before they formed X, they met in a poetry workshop at Beyond Baroque Bookstore in LA. Those punk and post-punk, but surely earlier than that, if we think of Dylan and Jim Morrison, that coming out of traditions in which I want to rebel against the kind of easy confines of pop trappings means that, well, instead of, when I have an image, it's going to be the Deaf Policeman, which is come from No Thugs in Our House off English Settlement. I can never stop thinking about him. And all the while little Graham slept on, dreaming of a world where he could do just what he wanted to. It's amazing. it's amazingly simple. And what Partridge does in that song, of course, is that he gives us this character in this situation that we are simultaneously upset with and angry, and feel compassion towards. He's another troubled youth, and that's incredibly hard to do. I think the songwriters that I would say we might argue are the most poetic are the ones that avoid the trappings of pop sensibility as much as possible. And most of those people are less popular. I think of one of my favorite songs by Neil Young is Pocahontas, which just starts off with this incredibly visual image. The aurora borealis, the icy skies at night, paddles cut the water in a long and hurried flight. It's like, whoa, there's your meter, your rhyme scheme. You are driven into this narrative, but it starts in the heavens and then it goes down into water immediately. It's like, wow. But that is so captivating. It captures the eye, in part because it does, it does that leap, right? It sets us up in the sky and then it leaps immediately downward. It's a very poetic leap in that way we think of leaping.
His Cortez the Killer kind of does similar things
Yeah.
too, right? And it's another one that's maybe rejecting some pop sensibilities. So Mark comments in the chat, the best attempt that he's seen in recent memory is John K. Sampson of Propagandhi, The Weaker Thans, and his own solo work. He also writes John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats, whom I love. His lyrics are very poetic, but his albums are more narrative in structure, and so it seems to make sense he turned into a solid novelist.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that I do think, I mentioned Pocahontas, you mentioned Cortez the Killer. And I think, we talk about the Mountain Goats, we talk about those narrative stories, which surely come out of the ballad tradition. I did a talk a couple of weeks ago in which I talked about the relationship of murder ballads to horror punk, which is this idea, of course, these are sort of morality plays played out through murder ballads. And you just kind of add a 1980s slasher flick sensibility to it all, and you have a horror punk song. I think that ballad tradition that plays through narratives plays particularly well for this idea of a kind of poetic lyric. I love Propagandhi's lyrics. I think there's that long tradition that they fall into that goes right back, all the way back to somebody like, say, the lesser songs. I say the lesser songs, I mean the lesser known songs, rather, of The Clash. I think of All Lost in the Supermarket, which I think is incredibly poetic, more so than you think of Strummer, who his protest songs, which we're sort of more aware of in some ways, don't have. But there's something, I think, when the songwriter gets personal in a way that ignores a kind of triteness, I think the songwriter allows themselves into that position to create metaphors and develop a sensibility that is kind of poetic in a way that they're not relying on certain pop structures. And I think that's why we see this in more alternative musics across the board. Right. I'm all lost in a supermarket. I'm all lost in a supermarket. How can I not forget the second verse? Wow, gone. I'm sorry, folks. Somebody's going to type it out for me here.
Yeah, I'm getting it for you.
I'm lost in the supermarket. I came in here for a special offer, a guaranteed personality. I mean, I wasn't born so much as I fell out. Nobody seemed to notice me. We had a hedge back home in the suburbs over which I never could see. I mean, that is a poem. That is the opening to a poem. It says so much about the home without saying anything about the home.
Dang it, technology is not letting me do the lyrics.
It's
Give me the
okay.
lyrics in the chat.
I wanted to be away from the chorus. I wanted to be in that first verse anyway, which was more important. Although I've totally lost street cred for not knowing this.
So we have some more comments here. So also from Mark, it does seem understandable that Blue Oyster Cult's more narrative tracks are less popular than something like Burn In For You or Don't Fear the Reaper. Though, of course, you know, in this moment, I've got the triangle in my head. And John writes, I can no longer shop.
Yeah. Can no longer shop happily. It came to me right as we were reading Mark's comment, actually. But even that idea that what does it mean to shop happily, right? You know, it's there. The hook there is actually Strummer at his most kind of anti-capitalist and most protesty. And I do think this, you know, it should be no surprise that that urge for familiarity, even in punk songs, right? You can be a little more poetic because there's a long tradition in punk of these sort of punk poets. Jim Carroll comes to mind, on top of Patti Smith, on top of Richard Hell, top of Andy Partridge, Elvis Costello, right? That tradition is established. And I think the fact that pop songs in particular maintain the trappings of the ballad and hymnal traditions. And by that, I mean all rock songs, is that they're probably a little more accessible, even something you know, punk and rap come into this tradition too. I think it's also why jazz is a less popular musical form, and jazz hybrids less popular than anything that comes out of the blues tradition, because the blues tradition is still maintaining that ballad sensibility. I also think that it's part of the reason why that idea of standards is also the reason why certain songs are more popular than others. It's a really amazing time in music when we think about in pop music right now, everything is producer driven. Hits are producer driven. Artists are often just singers, which means that the producer is often co-writing the lyrics and handling all the instrumentation. And the idea being, of course, that these songs all kind of sound the same. And it becomes a sort of a feedback loop. And then when somebody breaks that feedback loop because it needs to happen, people get tired of hearing multiple variations of the same thing. That then becomes its own feedback loop. You know, it's pretty amazing when you think, you know, I talked about changes in technology and modernism, but people never really think about the changes in technology in the 80s that led to the popularity of rap and what we used to call college rock, but then became alternative. And that is the combination of MTV and the birth of CDs. MTV created a place where they needed to fill 24 hours worth of programming. And at the beginning, they didn't have it. That's how Devo broke. Devo actually had video content. But when CDs become a thing, CDs are 5 inches wide. You had a ton of record stores with 12-inch wide cabinets. So Jen Brown, I'm sure you remember this. John Burroughs, I'm sure you remember this. CDs used to sit side by side in one record bin. And they used to have that big plastic or a big cardboard box and then the CD at the top. Well, you effectively doubled the capacity of record stores, the volume capacity in record stores. And simultaneously, making CDs, even though they charged more for them, is incredibly cheap. And so what happened was, gee, we have to fill these slots. And you can only sell so many ELO records at any given time in any given Sam Goody store. Remember those? In a mall. And so what do? Well, you make these two types of music that are getting regular airplay on MTV already. And you blow them up. And you blow them up, and suddenly you have alternative and you have hip hop. And it's no surprise that these things become popular at the very time CDs and MTV happen. You cannot remove music and how lyrics happen then, because what happens is, of course, the birth of rap is filled with takedowns of other rappers. There's this kind of rap braggadocio that goes on for a while that is the trappings of all the lyrics, and then it has to change. And then, of course, it changes. It becomes gangster rap, which sells a shit ton of records because of all the controversy around it. You know, but even that is coming out of an oral tradition of urban youth, right? The history of hip hop lyrics is so interesting because they started out as a way of communicating with people in your community. I think you see that a great example of that is Public Enemy's 911 is a joke. Which starts, I dialed 911 a long time ago. It starts with that almost oral tradition of somebody complaining in the apartment next door, in the courtyard of the buildings.
We also see, though, that kind of movement from smaller labels into conglomerations, which shifts some of what's being presented. And
of course, what labels do in the name for selling records, and what labels refuse to do is pretty amazing. We like to think that there's a ton of artistic license, but there's not. My favorite story on that is another Neil Young story. He was on Reprise Records for years and years and years. The 80s come, and David Geffen offers him double what Reprise would give him. And he said, well, if you're going to do that, I want complete artistic integrity. I want to do whatever I want. And David Geffen said, sure. And so what does he do? He does a rockabilly record. He does an electronica record. He does a swing record. He does a couple of what we think of typical Neil Young records, but he just plays because he was given a kind of freedom to experiment that he didn't have. And when he was done, he went back to Reprise and, went back to being Neil Young and Crazy Horse. but labels don't like to give complete artistic creation, which is why they often pick the producer for a band. And a producer has so much say. Try the lyrics this way. When a producer tells you try a lyric this way, you can fight him or her on it, but eventually, they're the ones saying, do it again. Sing it with more feeling. Do it again. Say it with less words. Oh, there we go. Now you just did what I asked you to do originally.
So we have just a quick remark in the chat that Jack Antonoff is so good, though. That's from Mark.
Yeah, Jack Antonoff is good. They're just, what it comes down to is that poetry and song lyric writing are radically different art forms that seem, because of the way they handle language, because of the way we think of the history of poetry, etc., they are, obviously in the same family and obviously very similar. I would say they're siblings. My brother and I are very similar in a lot of ways. We're very different in a lot of ways. And part of it is his purpose in life and my purpose in life are very different. And I would say that's probably true of the difference between song lyrics and poems. Their inherent artistic difference is that songs are conscious of their tradition, of their punk rockness, of their hip hopness, of the things that came before. Even if they are rejecting them, they are conscious of it and are conscious of the strictures of song structure and technique. Now, that's not to say there aren't people doing radical free jazz. That Marquee Moon, that first television record with that, 7.5-minute song is breaking so many rules of pop songwriting. Artists are given plenty of opportunity to do that. But I think that in poetry, that is the expectation. Poets are writing in a tradition, but that tradition is based in at least the United States and in the Western world in English. It is based on some of those dictums established by Romanticism and Modernism. And they are songwriters are allowed to embrace cliche, for instance, in a way that poets are taught to move away from.
So we're really kind of butting up against a time boundary, but there is one question in the chat here from Mark. Taylor Swift famously writes her own song lyrics. So she's working with top talent. Do you think Taylor could write good poems?
I don't know whether Taylor could write good poems, but she's a hell of a lyricist. She is a hell of a lyricist. I think a lot of people find her easy to dismiss because she looks a certain way and she plays a certain style of music that I think in general, people who are very parochial about their coolness can go, oh, but let me tell you, you read the lyrics to a song like our song and you'll be blown away. And so could she write good poems? I think she would be a better poet than Jewel. Look, I think most people who actually spent time reading poems and, gave it a try can write good poems. So I think if Taylor Swift wanted to and really wanted to put the effort in, she could write some damn good poems. But I'll say this, she's written a lot of damn good song lyrics, and there ain't nothing wrong with that.
I could not ask for a better line on which to end. Gerry, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, thank you. And I do feel like I need to issue a correction. I don't know what the synapse problem was I had, but it's not a triangle, it's a damn cowbell. There's a whole Saturday Night Live sketch about it. So before I lose my street cred, I know it's a cowbell. All right, and Gerry, thanks
we need
again.
more of it, Jen.
It's true. It's always true. And we have one more event coming up, which is the Kestrel reading. I hope if you're with us right now, you will join us for that. And Gerry, thanks again. And as the hashtag that appeared in the chat says, next year in Frostburg, let's hope.
Definitely.